Hi, my name is Brad, and this is episode 2 in a YouTube lecture series on intonation in English called Listening for Meaning. Thanks to everyone who watched and listened to episode 1, and to those who sent me back feedback, which was very helpful and encouraging. One bit of feedback was to break up these long lectures into bite-sized chunks, maybe 10 minutes, which of course is very good advice for YouTube videos in general. However, I've designed this series more as conventional lectures. Each episode has its own internal coherence and structure, like a chapter in a book. Also like a chapter in a book, but unlike live in-person university lectures. You can stop and restart this video at any time you like. This series then, in this sense, is intended to be a sort of multimodal textbook. In episode 1, I briefly introduced the series and Halliday's systemic functional linguistic approach to intonation systems in English, which, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, is a meaning-based approach to the study of language, which includes intonational systems within the language description. I highlighted important differences between speech and writing, and the consequences of writing lacking any reliable representation of intonation. One thing I neglected to mention, because I had forgotten, is that some of the material in episode 1 is presented in a chapter I wrote called Speech and Writing, Intonation in Multimodal Studies, for an edited book, Multimodal Studies, co-edited by K. O'Halloran and myself and published by Routledge. I've linked to this in the description for episode 1 and for this video. One of the reasons I've always struggled with publishing anything on intonation is the difficulty of talking about speech in the written mode. So it's nice now to be able to bring the written word to life, so to speak, in the spoken mode. One name I neglected also to mention in relation to my fascination with reading written text aloud in terms of intonation choices is the late Martin Davies. Martin and I bonded entirely through written email dialogue over our mutual fascination with this area, which was Martin's long-term specialisation and, as for me, something of an obsession, which he referred to in colourful terms as the black hole in graphology, the title of his chapter in an edited volume on systemic phonology edited by Wendy Boucher and myself. I will come back to Martin's work later in this series. In this episode, I delve further into the world of intonation by presenting a broad introductory outline of the key systems of intonation in English within the SFL description. And in presenting these systems, I will introduce the SFL transcription system, which captures the key elements of the SFL description of intonation systems. I will also give a brief introduction to some of the functions of these systems in spoken discourse, including discourse functions of what Halliday refers to as rhythm and salience. And here, as I mentioned in episode 1, I draw on work by Theo van Leeuwen, who, unlike Halliday, has made a dedicated study in this area since the mid-1980s. So here is the text that I used to introduce key concepts of intonation in episode 1. I have added in the SFL-based transcription system, which I will outline in this episode. How's your meal? It's nice, it's nice. You're not entirely happy with it? I will work through all these symbols and formatting and their functions, but just as a quick introduction to the systems discussed so far, the numerals represent the type of pitch contour from the tone system of English, while the asterisk before the forward slash and bold font represent the location of emphasis, or the syllable where the pitch contour begins, which is called the tonic syllable, and represents a choice in the system of tonicity. I will go into further detail on these systems later on, and will explain the other symbols and formatting which show choices in salience, rhythm, and tonality. So, as I briefly introduced in episode 1, the tone system of English is made up of 5 pitch contour types, which Halliday numbered from 1 to 5. So here, in response to the question, "How's your meal?" one could reply, "It's nice." Falling contour. "It's nice." Rising contour. "It's nice," which is the level or slight rise contour. "It's nice," which is the falling rising contour, which we heard in the text last episode. And "it's nice," which is the rising falling pitch contour. And remember, you can slow down this YouTube video to hear these tones more clearly. I recommend 0.5 speed for distinguishing tone choices. So this system is logical in origin. It's based on the opposition between falling and rising pitch contours, tones 1 and 2, respectively, with combinations of these, tones 4 and 5, respectively, falling rising and rising falling, and tone 3, the level rise or level or slight rise as a midway between falling and rising. I think you can also hear how this reply sounds and means something different with each of these different tones. This basic system has been around for a long time. Here are 2 pages on tones and pitch from Henry Sweet's 1877 Handbook of Phonetics, considered to be a classic and foundation of modern phonological study. Sweet's account is remarkably similar to Halliday's, with the level tone, the rising and falling tones, and their combinations, what Sweet calls compound tones, of falling rising and rising falling. He begins with reference to the same view that I presented in the previous episode, that, quote, "changes of tone may proceed either by leaps or glides," end quote. In my terms, either pitch jumps or contours. He also provides an insightful, if brief, sketch of the functions of these tones in spoken discourse. So 273, quote, "The level tone may be heard in well, as an expression of musing or meditation, the rising in questions or doubtful statements, the falling in answers, commands, or dogmatic assertions," end quote. And it's interesting here that Sweet doesn't distinguish between the 2 types of question I discussed in episode 1. As I also mentioned in episode 1, in a different use of the term compound to Henry Sweet's in the previous slide, Halliday's tone system also includes 2 compound tones, which are formed by a combination of either the falling contour tone 1 or the rising falling contour tone 5 with the level rise tone 3. "It's nice, thanks." "It's nice in spite of my expectations." I will come back in a later episode to explain why these are considered essentially one tone choice rather than 2 distinct tone choices. And as also mentioned in episode 1, Halliday identified several secondary tones in his description, which are variations on the 5 primary tones. I will go through these in a later episode, but as an illustrative example, the falling pitch contour tone 1 can also have as variations a high falling contour, which is often used for contrast. "I didn't buy apples, I bought peaches." And a low falling contour, often used for a sort of anticlimactic end to a turn. "So that's all I bought." I will talk in more detail in a later episode about these systems, their transcription, and how to identify these choices. Another secondary tone I will discuss in detail in a later episode, is what Halliday calls the broken or sharp rise-fall-rise tone 2 variation, commonly heard with the expression, "Who, me?" I will also come back to my transcription symbol for this, which is different to Halliday's. So, one of Halliday's most important insights on intonation is that the rising-falling pitch contour distinction essentially makes comment on what is called the polarity of a clause, which is, quote, the choice between positive and negative, end quote. So the reason why a falling tone is used in the unmarked case with the declarative mood to make statements, whereas a rising tone is used with polar interrogative mood for a yes-no question, is because a falling tone says, in essence, I know this is, it is. Whereas a rising tone asks about polarity, is it? Then the falling rising contour says, in effect, it is, but there is some question about whether it is. While the rising falling contour says, it is. There is no question, it definitely is. And the level rise contour, tone 3, opts out of this commentary on polarity. It is. As Halliday pointed out, this underlying function of tone to comment on polarity is why interrogatives typically have a falling contour, because it is not the polarity that is at issue, but some specific aspect of the proposition, who, what it is, etc. However, Halliday emphasises that the functions of tone have to be understood in the environment of particular mood choices in the clause. Hence, he sets up a series of what he calls key systems as part of the grammar of English. I will come back to present and discuss these key systems in a later episode, but in more general functional terms, tones are involved in making what Halliday termed interpersonal meanings, which are how we use language to interact with others. In particular, as just mentioned, tone choices work together with mood choices in the clause. Mood choices are the resources of clause grammar that enable us to ask questions, make statements, give commands, etc., which are options in the semantic system of speech function. But as we will see, tone adds another often crucial dimension to interpersonal interactions in spoken discourse. Consider this example of a typical opening move in a telephone fast food sales text. This is from an actual telephone sale of pizza, which formed the data for the study cited in this slide, and as always the reference is in the description, which I was allowed to use as part of the data for my PhD thesis, comparing intonation choices across different types of texts or registers of spoken discourse. Can I start the order with your phone number, please? Here there is a polar interrogative mood in the clause grammar, can I, which typically in its unmarked function is used to enact a yes-no question in the system of speech function. But here, this opening move, called an initiating move, is not functioning as a yes-no question. The speaker here is not actually asking whether he can actually start with the customer's phone number. If the tone used was a rising contour, tone 2, then this would sound a little oddly in this context, like a genuine question. Can I start the order with your phone number, please? In fact, the falling contour, tone 1, is being used in a marked way to tell us that this move is actually either a command or a content question, in effect meaning, respectively, give me your phone number or what is your phone number. And note, because the move is enacted through tone and not mood, it is not clear whether it is a content question or a command. This is because intonation, rather than clause grammar, is doing the job of enacting the speech function choice. Of course, if this demand had been enacted through either of the two unmarked expressions at the bottom of this slide, these both would be considered a bit too abrupt, assertive, or impolite from a salesperson, even with the please tacked on the end, and with the level rise tone 3 of a compound tone 1-3. Give me your phone number, please. Or, what is your phone number, please? So both tone and mood choices are being used in marked ways in this move, swapping their conventional speech function roles. While the tone 1 gets the telephone sales interaction moving along quickly in terms of what the salesperson wants to get done with language, the polar interrogative mood, can I, is functioning to soften this otherwise abrupt demand, enacting an interpersonal meaning of deference or politeness. This meaning of deference relates to another aspect of SFL theory, which is the context in which the text occurs, which is also considered meaningful. Specifically, these choices here involve what are called the tenor relations, the social relations between the interactants. In this interaction, a complex of two types of social relation: an unequal hierarchy of a customer service salesperson who needs to be deferential to the customer, together with the salesperson's role as the one who needs to take charge of the telephone sales interaction, to control how it unfolds according to a particular format or structure, to get started with the customer's phone number and not, as some customers assume, with the actual pizza order, which comes after the exchange of contact details. So, as we can see, or in fact hear, language is immensely complex. As you can also see and hear by now, intonation is crucial in spoken language, which makes it all the more interesting that not only does writing not represent intonation, as I discussed in the first episode, but the vast majority of studies of spoken discourse don't include these intonation choices and their contributions to meaning in research and teaching work, which is also something I will come back to in later lectures and is in fact a theme or an underlying rationale for this course. Okay, so we've now finished with tone and its interpersonal functions, and we will next move on to intonation systems that help in weaving meanings into coherent text, called textual systems. Although you can of course stop this video anytime you like, if you are treating this as a live lecture and watching it through, this is a good place to take a break, as we are about halfway through the content. You can click on the YouTube link in the description for some nice intermission music from Monty Python while you make some tea. So, as mentioned before intermission, now I move from talking about interpersonal tone choices to talking about systems of intonation that are used to weave meanings together into coherent text that is relevant to context, called textual systems. I begin with what I was referring to in episode 1 as emphasis. As I introduced there, the syllable where a pitch contour occurs, specifically where it begins, emphasizes that particular syllable and, by extension, that word. So in the first line in this text that I've been using, the first syllable of the word happy is the point at which the rising pitch contour begins. Thus the word happy is emphasized. You're not entirely happy with it? Any word or part of a word can be emphasized in an utterance. Here are 3 versions of the first line of that text. How's your meal? How's your meal? How is your meal? Halliday termed this system tonicity. The syllable where the pitch contour begins, which is shown after a forward slash with an asterisk, is called the tonic syllable, or just tonic for short. I also indicate the tonic syllable here in bold and in italics, which I will explain in a later episode. Again, different choices of tonicity make different meanings for the same written text. As mentioned in episode 1, such emphasis is used to steer conversation in one direction or another, according to what is emphasized or highlighted by such choices in tonicity. I use the metaphor of the rudder of a ship. In later episodes, I will discuss what it means to choose in textual intonation systems, which in SFL have tended to be viewed from a structural perspective in terms of given new structure. Another lesser form of emphasis is called salience in Halliday's description. Here are 3 different choices in salience for the final line in the example that I've been using. You're not entirely happy with it. You're not entirely happy with it. You're not entirely happy with it. If you have trouble hearing these differences, you can go back and re-listen as often as you like. And for these choices, I prefer 0.75 speed in YouTube. But I intend to provide plenty of practice on texts in later episodes, so don't worry, it does take time to hear these distinctions, even though we use them every day, hundreds or thousands of times a day. In the transcription, the salient syllables follow a / and are in italics. And note, salience generally falls on the primary stress in a word, so that a word may be broken up in the transcription by the / as for entirely in the first line and italics in the heading. And remember, the purpose of the transcription is to tell us which syllable is salient, because salience makes meaning in the discourse. That is, this is a meaning-based transcription system. The upside-down V, or caret symbol, means that the utterances in the first 2 lines begin with a non-salient syllable, you're. You're not entirely happy with it. You're not entirely happy with it. So you can compare this to the 3rd line where your is salient. You're not entirely happy with it. This symbol can also indicate a silent beat or pause in an established rhythm, which I will discuss shortly. Salience is primarily caused by jumps up and down in pitch level or height, but without a pitch contour being formed by the pitch movement. So what Sweet calls leaps rather than glides. I will come back in a later episode to discuss the identification of salience and other phonological choices. There is also another form of salience where a jump up in pitch is significantly larger than in ordinary salience, roughly similar to what has been termed phonological paragraphing. And I've cited Lehist 1975 here, which is considered a foundational paper on the phonological paragraph. However, such significant jumps in pitch height have broader functions than just chunking up spoken discourse into phonological paragraphs. Here I adapt the text I've been using to illustrate its use. How's your meal? I'm not entirely happy with it. Sue Hood coined the term supersalience for this phenomenon during our work for the book Modelling Paralanguage using Systemic Functional Semiotics, which I have cited here, to account for this broader range of functions. Supersalience is indicated by a vertical arrow before the supersalient syllable in the transcription. This choice, which has, like much in intonation studies, not been well researched, appears to function to signal what is called a hypertheme, a term coined by Danius and taken up by Martin in English text, building on Peter Free's work on method of development. So here Speaker 2, by assigning a significant jump up in pitch on not, is signalling, I want to talk now about my dissatisfaction with this meal. I will come back to explore this phenomenon in a later episode, including work by Radan Martinek on how textual meanings form waves upon waves over different scales in discourse. Theo van Leeuwen takes a different approach to the analysis of what Halliday calls salience and tonicity, using the terms accent and juncture. I will go into further detail on his terms and their rationale in a later episode. But essentially Van Leeuwen separates out the phonological phenomena of interpersonal and textual choices in speech, which allowed him, I think, to generate more insights on textual systems of intonation. I use Halliday's terminology in this series for reasons I'll explain in a later episode, but it was from van Leeuwen's work in this area, and this reading in particular, that I began to realise the importance of these phenomena in spoken discourse. Quote, "Studying what speakers' accent can be a way of reading the mind of the social institutions within which their speech is located. Thus, if several announcers, in reading the same radio commercial, accent a personal pronoun, if you're looking for a top-quality used car, we can interpret this exception to the rule that only content words receive an accent as the realisation of a strategy of the social institution of advertising, a strategy placing emphasis on the personal nature of what is in fact one of the most impersonal and distant forms of communication the world has known, a strategy of making the listeners believe that they are personally addressed." And I think this is what is happening, as I mentioned in episode 1, with the well-known YouTube series, This Is Your Daily Dose of Internet, a way of creating a sense of personal parasocial connection through a broadcast medium. Choices in salience and tonicity group words together in ways that create rhythms in speech at different levels. Firstly, salience breaks up the flow of speech into rhythm units called feet, similar to a bar in music or to meter in poetry. And I've put some nice examples of music related to the title of this slide in the description. Each foot has one salient syllable, except where the first syllable in an utterance is a non-salient syllable, as I mentioned earlier and also in this text here. This is a line from the George Bernard Shaw play Pygmalion, to which I have added the intonation choices for a 1973 BBC performance, which can be found at the link below in the description. This line appears at 58 minutes and 6 seconds. I will read from my transcription here now. "The shallow depression to the west of these islands is likely to move slowly in an easterly direction." You can hear the roughly steady rhythm, called an isochronic rhythm, with salient syllables at roughly equal time intervals, except for likely to move, which is a bit longer between the salient syllables. There is an argument that in the BBC version I've linked to, there could be 3 other tonic tone contours on depression, islands, and slowly. Such analysis is sometimes not easy, but I've found that where the analysis is difficult, there is usually a good reason for the difficulty, something going on that is itself of analytical interest. I will address such issues as I go along in later episodes, and will come back to this text. In the case of this text, of course, not only is this a BBC stage production, that is, acted rather than natural everyday speech, but the character Liza herself also speaks in an abnormally formalised, precise, almost mechanical way at this point as a result of her recent training by Professor Higgins. So one doesn't always find such regularised, clearly enunciated rhythms in everyday speech. I will use more natural, everyday spoken texts in later episodes. But in such formalised speech, it is often difficult to distinguish between salience and tonicity. So, as with previous systems, we can vary the choices of salience to create different rhythm choices with different groupings of words, and thus different meanings in the text. Here is another version of the Pygmalion line with different salience and rhythm choices. In this case, there are less salient syllables or more words per foot, so that the speech seems to flow a bit quicker than in the previous version. "The shallow depression to the west of these islands is likely to move slowly in an easterly direction." The way words in speech are grouped via salience into feet in different rhythms influences the way we interpret the importance of different parts of a text. At a level above the foot, or to use Halliday's term, at a higher rank, a tone group is formed by the presence of a tone contour, as is indicated by double forward slashes at each end of the tone group. That is, the occurrence of tone contours divides the flow of speech into tone groups in the same way that salience divides the flow of speech into feet, as we have just seen. This division of spoken discourse into tone groups via the occurrence of tonic contours is called the system of tonality. Here there is one tone group for this long clause. But we can of course also vary the choices in tonality, and we would expect tonality to chunk up a long clause such as this into at least two smaller bite-sized tone groups, as is done here in this slide. The shallow depression to the west of these islands is likely to move slowly in an easterly direction. Note here also, as I mentioned before, the caret symbol, the upside down V, can also indicate that there is a silent beat in an established rhythm. So here there is a pause after islands. The shallow depression to the west of these islands is likely to move slowly in an easterly direction. We call this a pause with a capital P, which is a meaningful silence. Here the pause coming after the complex grammatical subject of this clause, the shallow depression to the west of these islands, gives additional importance to this part of the clause. These silent beats are involved in indicating important moments in the overall organisation of texts, and very important, for example, in lectures and in speeches. So, like rhythm but at a higher level or rank, tonality can also group certain words together in a variety of ways, thus enabling the speaker to control the flow of information in terms of the relative importance of different parts of a text, enabling more or less instances of tonicity, of pitch contours and their associated emphases across stretches of text. However, tonality, as with rhythm and the division of the flow of speech into feet, is not just about how many tone groups there are for a given stretch of text. The way the tone groups divide up the text, which words go with which, is also part of the action of this system, as it works together with choices in tone, salience, rhythm and tonicity to make possible many variations of a text, many different Pygmalions. Here is another version of the Pygmalion line with different choices in tonality and other systems. Now this long clause is divided up into three tone groups, and there are different groupings of the words in each tone group from the play compared to the previous version. The shallow depression to the west of these islands is likely to move slowly in an easterly direction. So in general terms, these textual choices help to manage the flow of discourse by signalling the relative importance of different parts of the text. For example, they can highlight certain words that have appraisal value in the text, which I will address in a later episode. These systems thus help in creating coherence within the text and relevance to some context, which is often in a dialogue what has just been said before, as in this example. The shallow depression to the west of these islands is likely to move slowly in an easterly direction. Is it? Here, speaker 1 makes is salient, picking it out as for some reason important. And this is a mark choice. As referred to in the Van Leeuwen article I quoted earlier, it is supposed to be content words that are accented, not grammatical words. Then speaker 2 picks up on this mark choice of salience and makes is tonic. Now the conversation has shifted to a focus on this interpersonal aspect of the discourse. One of the most important functions of such textual intonation choices is in shifting a text from a focus on the things and processes being talked about, called experiential meanings, to the interpersonal aspects of the discourse. So, as we can see or hear, these intonational systems are quite complex, offering many different options within different systems for making different meanings in spoken text. But we can also see how these systems all work together to create a unity, a spoken text. Thus, SFL takes what we call a holistic meaning-based approach to the analysis of text. At the same time, as I've shown in this lecture, SFL's multisystemic approach enables us to distinguish the distinct contributions of the different systems and types of systems, to show how complex meaning in text is created out of many choices working together. In particular, we can distinguish two main types of functions of intonation, as I've shown in this lecture. Interpersonal functions of tone with mood choices in the clause, and textual functions of salience and rhythm, tonicity and tonality, which work together with other text-forming aspects of language, as I'll show in subsequent lectures. In the next episodes, I will explore these two main sets of systems and their functions, how they are manifested in different ways in terms of the phonetic expression, or in different ways of organising and expressing sound, and the distinct discourse functions of the intonational choices that are made through these different types of expression. I will also start to explore some different texts and aspects involved in analysing phonetic expression as phonological choice, to get some practice in applying the intonation choices I've outlined in this episode in the analysis of everyday spoken discourse. These two sets of systems, interpersonal and textual, and their expression in phonetics and phonology, are termed more broadly, respectively, prosodic and periodic systems in Knorr et al. 2022, which book I mentioned earlier. Seeing these systems in these terms enables us to account for how the intonation choices I briefly outlined in this lecture work together with a range of other semiotic systems such as vocal effect and gesture in multimodal discourses. Two chapters in this book that are particularly relevant in this respect are chapters 5 and 6, dealing with, respectively, interpersonal and textual meanings. To finish, as I presented in episode 1, here is a screenshot from the 1938 film production of Pygmalion, which is linked in the description, where an entirely different version of this scene is scripted, with this well-known line replacing the line in the original play quoted earlier. This scene and this line, as you can see in this image from YouTube, appears a little after the 41-minute mark. I will read off my transcription here. The rain in Spain, they say, stays mainly in the plains. Although the words are different for this same scene as in the original play, the function of this scene within the film production and the play's script at this point is the same: to highlight Liza's slavish adherence to pronunciation or phonetic expression, but with mindless commentary about the weather, phonetics without sense within the context. But as I will show in the next episode, immediately following this line is an interaction that I consider pivotal in this film production in this sense, showing the development of Liza's character as she begins to assert herself in her new social context, and how the script's proper interpretation at this point hinges crucially upon an understanding of intonation, to quote Paul Tench, what it is and what it does.